Good morning and welcome to NAPCAN's final webinar in our official National Child Protection Week series, which is appropriately called Building Back Better. In this session, we are aiming to finish by looking towards the actions that we can all take to create a great future for all Australia's children. My name is Teresa Scott and I'm the NAPCAN's Board President. To start off this morning, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am sitting today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, in the beautiful part of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge all elders past, present and emerging from all the lands you may be watching from today, and also welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are logged on as well. I'd like to also particularly acknowledge the children and young people of Australia, because that's what this week is all about: their well-being, health and happiness, and a life free from violence and neglect. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. If you're like me and not the greatest with technology, don't worry, you cannot unmute yourself or turn your camera on. This is definitely a listen-only function. If you do run into some technical issues, please ring our team, who have left their contact details in the chat question function for you, which is on the right of your screen. The chat question function is enabled for questions. We do have hundreds of people online today and limited time, but we will try to get to your questions. If not, we will be recording the questions to look at later. All webinars are recorded and will be posted on our website in due course. So now on to our final webinar for National Child Protection Week, which of course makes it rather special. It has been a huge National Child Protection Week, despite the challenges of COVID, and in some ways because of COVID-19. The pandemic has really shone a light on the importance of prevention, and in the context of National Child Protection Week, the need to support families and communities in order to put children first. Being the 30th anniversary of the campaign has also made this a particularly reflective year, but a year that recognises the need for action now. We know that a one-week campaign is not the answer to everything. We know that protecting children needs to be a year-round priority. But what this week does so well is start important conversations and share important information, strategies and actions that we can all take away and use throughout the year. This year, the theme, Putting Children First, has resonated with so many different groups and communities around Australia, from all levels of government, to those working directly with children and young people, through to those running organisations such as sports clubs and local businesses, as well as lots of individuals who just care about children. And the online format means that our audience has gone well beyond the familiar faces that are typically involved in physical events, with more than 6,000 webinar registrations for the week and about 400 logos now on the campaign page. It has been wonderful to welcome so many new people to the campaign. For me personally, this is my 17th year of being involved in some form or other, usually as president. So whether this is your 30th year of your first, I'm so glad that you are here to be part of this important conversation. This is a session to think about practical steps to build back better, to shift collectively towards a fairer, safer community for all Australian children. To help us do that, we'll be hearing from 4 experts who are working on key national campaigns and initiatives that you can all get involved with. I'll introduce all the speakers as they come on screen, but just for context, we will be hearing from Dr. Brian Babington from Families Australia, Brenton Philp from the Department of Social Services, Richard Weston from SNAKE, and Leith Sterling from the Every Child campaign. So, first cab off the rank today, I would like to introduce Dr. Brian Babington, who many of you may already know. Welcome, Brian. Brian is the long-standing CEO of Families Australia and has tirelessly led the national framework for protecting Australia's children for the non-government sector since the onset. Over to you, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and good morning, everyone. And thank you all very much for joining us this morning for what I think will be a really sort of great end to all the wonderful webinars of National Child Protection Week. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'm on the lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. I'd like very much to acknowledge the work that NAPCAN has been doing over many, many years. It's outstanding work to improve outcomes for children and families. Families Australia, as a national peak body, has been working closely with NAPCAN over those many years for improved child and family wellbeing and safety, and particularly against the backdrop of significant ongoing national challenges. And I just want to mention three to get the ball rolling. And one is that we've seen a threefold increase in the number of children in out-of-home care over the past 2 decades to reach a number now around 45,000. Second, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people are being placed in out-of-home care at a rate that's 10 times that for non-Indigenous children. And thirdly, that we find that there's been a 50% increase in the number of substantiations of child abuse and neglect over just the past decade. At Families Australia, our starting question has always been, how can we make Australia a country in which all children and young people grow up safe and well? And that was the question that we posed to over 800 people from across government, non-government organisations and academia, as well as parents, young people, carers and other community representatives in the past year or two, as we travelled around the country to invite ideas to help design the successor to the national framework for protecting Australia's children. Now, by way of background, and many of you may be aware of the national framework and indeed have attended one of our consultations over that past year or two, or even further back in time. The national framework was established in 2009 when all Australian governments, supported strongly by the non-government and research sectors, came together for the first time to decide on a concerted new national approach that was needed to turn around unacceptable rates of child abuse and neglect. It was highly significant, remains highly significant, in that it's the nation's first ever plan to improve child safety and wellbeing. Now, it's a plan that after 12 years is about to come to its end. Our consultations revealed a profound sense that despite great effort and commitment, far more needs to be done to turn around child abuse in Australia. What we found was that there was a resounding agreement that the successor to the national framework must drive real change by galvanising collective effort across government sectors and disciplines in actions that the evidence tells us will address the causal factors that will prevent children, young people and their families from entering child protection systems. In our report, which I'll just hold up here, and that's available on the Families Australia website, and I think will be distributed also to those attending, identified several priority areas for future national policy. And in a nutshell, I won't go through, it's a very long report, I think it's all of 157 pages, but in a nutshell, some of the key messages from participants were that the next national framework should be long-term, measurable, aspirational and achievable. And it should contain desired outcomes, targets and timeframes, and be positively framed around a comprehensive view of children's lives that includes, but is not limited to, safety and protection, and which emphasises prevention. It should identify and track high-level outcomes which align with existing national policies in areas such as education, housing, youth, and related activities. And here, for example, I mention the importance of bringing together much more the work of the national framework with the National Plan of Action to Reduce Violence Against Women and their Children as one of the key sorts of initiatives that we need to work on to bring much more closely together. People in our consultations also talked about the importance of strengthening prevention and early support and focusing on families with the greatest level of multiple and complex need. Prioritising the voices of children, young people and families came through really strongly in the consultations, perhaps much more than when we started the journey of the national framework all those years ago. And it was also about a conversation about how we can encourage the community to value children and childhood much more than we do. Finally, people were saying that we need to have a focus on priority key cohorts. We need to strengthen our efforts to address the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care. We need to make more effort to improve outcomes for young people who are transitioning from out-of-home care into independent adulthood. And we need to respond better to the needs of carers, including, and this came through very strongly in the consultations, young carers who have that responsibility. We need to particularly focus on them as well as the broader range of carers. In a moment, Brenton Philp from DSS will talk more about the next steps for the national framework. But suffice for me to say, and coming to the end now, coming months will see continued discussion between governments and the National Coalition on Child Safety and Wellbeing, and that's a grouping which is convened by Families Australia, has been for the life of the national framework to date, and it's a grouping of over 250 leading non-government organisations and researchers. So those conversations will continue. They've already commenced in terms of discussing with governments the key findings of our national consultations that I've been talking about. But although, and perhaps because we're in such seriously challenging times, we have an opportunity to build on the foundations of the national framework. And I'm very heartened that community service ministers in March this year committed their governments to a 10-year successor to the national framework and have been discussing key themes for inclusion in that next plan. I'll end by saying that the challenge for all of us is to make the successor to the national framework as ambitious and as effective as we possibly can, and to find ways in which we can catalyse and support the complex range of efforts, policies and programs across and within government and non-government sectors to achieve early, measurable and sustained improvements for children and their families. Thanks very much, Teresa.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate those comments, and I think that the information that your national consultation has gathered will be absolutely invaluable to the planning. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Brenton Philp from the Group Manager, Families Group from the Department of Social Services. Brenton will tell us more about the successor to the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, which, as Brian mentioned, officially concludes this year. So over to you, Brenton. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. And look, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you at today's National Child Protection Week webinar. It's truly a pleasure to be here. Now, before I start, could I also please first acknowledge and thank the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm very pleased the government has been able to support NAPCAN to deliver this important national week for many years. I'd also like to thank NAPCAN, my fellow panelists and others who have presented or provided input to the many presentations held this week. I'm sure you'll all agree they've been truly inspiring, and particularly for those of us here at the Commonwealth as we enter into the next phase and the successor plan. My role here is as a group manager within the Commonwealth Department of Social Services, and it involves working on national policy for Australia's children and families. As Assistant Minister Landry said in her video message earlier this week, National Child Protection Week is an occasion for all of us to reaffirm our commitment to do what we can to help ensure that every child in our nation is given every opportunity to grow up safely and has the support they need to do as well as they can. As we continue to deal with the ongoing and significant impacts of the coronavirus, putting children first must continue to be front of mind. Now, more than ever, supporting families and children is vitally important, and if we are to be successful, it requires both a short and long-term vision and sustained efforts across governments and the whole community. As many of you will know, the Australian government is providing a range of measures to help address the significant impacts of the coronavirus. Key measures include creating and extending JobKeeper and the temporary coronavirus supplement, providing additional childcare subsidies, and support including through the Early Childhood Education and Care Relief Package, and providing an additional $563 million to reinforce the aged care sector, which takes the government's support to senior Australians in aged care to over $1.5 billion since the pandemic began. Key initiatives within the Department of Social Services include providing an additional $150 million under the National Plan to reduce violence against women and their children. This additional funding will help support Australians experiencing domestic, family and sexual violence due to the fallout from the coronavirus. To minimise disruptions due to COVID-19, the department also extended grant agreements that were due to cease in June this year by a further 10 months until 31 March next year, or 2021, to community, family and children services that Australians rely on. In mental health, since January 2020, the Australian government has announced a number of emergency response measures to support the mental health and wellbeing of Australians. This includes funding for eligible health professionals to deliver mental health care via telehealth, boosting the capacity of mental health services, supporting the National Mental Health and Wellbeing Pandemic Response Plan, and supporting additional Medicare subsidised psychological therapy sessions. In the area of disability, the Australian government released a management and operational plan for COVID-19 for people with disability. This plan sets out a national approach to ensure that the healthcare needs of people with disability, their families and carers can be met during the pandemic, including access to appropriate screening, prevention and healthcare. But if I now turn to the National Framework Successor Plan, as Brian outlined, with the current National Framework ending next year, the Department of Social Services has been working with government and non-government stakeholders to consider the shape of what might follow. This year's National Child Protection Week theme, Putting Children First, really speaks to the focus that the Successor Plan needs to take. It needs to put children's needs first and priorities first, to build a safe environment for them to grow and to thrive. We know that children who experience disadvantage, abuse or neglect are much more likely to experience long-term problems in the areas of health, development, learning and behaviours. Providing the safest possible environment to children really sets the tone for the rest of their life. While there have been some good achievements under the national framework, we have not seen a reduction in the rates of child abuse and neglect substantiations, and the coronavirus pandemic has created even bigger challenges for keeping children safe. We've been listening to stakeholders through the consultations undertaken by Families Australia and learning from the evaluation of the national framework. And we are keen to work together with governments and the sector to refocus and reinvigorate collective work to deliver real and improved outcomes for children who are at risk of harm. Overall, Community Services Ministers, Family Australia's consultations and the National Framework evaluation have highlighted that the new plan should have clear and measurable outcomes and targets, as well as better define the involvement and accountability of all levels of government and sectors involved in improving the lives of children and family. Ministers also agree that the Successor Plan should focus on issues where there would be a demonstrable benefit in having a national approach, recognising the different circumstances of each jurisdiction, and also build on the significant work already underway across a range of priority areas. This could include improving protective factors and evidence-based prevention and early interventions to prevent engagement with the child protection system where possible. Other key focus areas could include supporting young people who are transitioning from out-of-home care, enhancing responses to young parents who may have been in care as children themselves, and young people who are kinship carers, which I think was a point that Brian made quite well. I'm also pleased that ministers provided in-principle support to develop a 10-year plan or a 10-year approach, reaffirming the importance of taking a long-term considered approach to all levels of government. In recognition of the Closing the Gap agreement, ministers agreed that the Successor Plan will be a key vehicle for reducing the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in out-of-home care. We also know that including non-government sector in the national framework was a key enabler to building trust, collaboration, and better policies. So working alongside my co-panellists, NAPCAN, Families Australia, SNAKE, and the Benevolent Society, as well as members of the National Coalition on Child Safety and Wellbeing, and many, many other service and support providers, has and will continue to be a strength of moving forward. Consistent with this year's National Child Protection Week theme of putting children first, ministers have agreed that facilitating greater input and involvement of children and young people in the Successor Plan will be a key principle, as will a co-design and engagement process with Indigenous communities. So moving to the next steps, I acknowledge there's a lot of work to be done over the coming months to agree the National Framework Successor Plan. The department is aiming to have further conversations with community services ministers throughout the remainder of this year and is planning further consultations for early next year. Please, I encourage you to all keep an eye on the DSS Engage website to see how you can contribute to this next process. Thank you, and thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Brenton. It sounds like a lot of work is being done and a lot more work to be done. And we will look out for keeping an eye on the DSS Engage link at some stage. Okay, well now it is my pleasure to introduce Richard Weston, who is the CEO of SNAKE. SNAKE stands for the Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare and is the key organisation that acts as the national voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Hi, Richard. It's nice to see you again. It's been another big year for SNAKE. Can you give us some insights into the Family Matters campaign and update us on the campaign's progress?
Thanks, Teresa. I want to start by thanking NAPCAN for the opportunity to speak today for National Child Protection Week. And I also want to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ancestors, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that wherever we are in Australia, we're on the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have never been ceded. I'm going to talk about Family Matters today, and Family Matters is Australia's national campaign to ensure that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people grow up safe and cared for in family, community, and culture. Family Matters is led by SNAKE and a group of eminent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders from across the country. And our campaign is supported by a strategic alliance of over 160 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous organisations. And I thank any representatives of those organisations that are watching today. And we really appreciate your support for the campaign. The goal of Family Matters is to turn around the serious and growing overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care by 2040. The National Closing the Gap agreement, which is brand new and just been announced at the end of July, has an intermediate target of reducing our representation in out-of-home care by 45% reduction by 2031. And that's been signed up to by all states, territories, Commonwealth, and even local government. And it's the first time ever we've had a target, an out-of-home care target for Aboriginal kids in the Closing the Gap arrangements. And this target was informed by evidence from the Family Matters annual reports that since 2016 have tracked experiences and outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families in child protection in out-of-home care across the 8 jurisdictions. The current trends for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are that they're 10.6 times more likely to be residing in out-of-home care than non-Indigenous kids. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are 37.3% of the total out-of-home care population, but only make up 5.5% of the total population of children in Australia. As of February this year, 17,979 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were living in out-of-home care, an increase of 39% from the 2019 Productivity Commission report on government services. Now, this number doesn't include children on permanent care orders or who have been adopted. So the actual number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who have been removed from their families is far higher. Over the last few years, we've seen greater efforts by governments to address overrepresentation. But what is clear is that there is still a very long way to go. Brian spoke earlier about the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, and this is an important policy piece in this battle to reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal kids in the system. In spite of some jurisdictions doing it better than in recent years, there are still major systemic issues that see the trend of our kids going into care moving upwards. And if we don't do something about it now, within 10 years' time, the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care will double within the next 10 years. It's clear that without substantial efforts to refocus policy and investment on prevention and early intervention, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children will continue to be at risk of separation from their families, communities, and culture. We know that household income and access to safe and healthy housing have a substantial impact on the capacity of families to provide safe and supportive care for children. Nearly 1/3 of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are living below the poverty line. A key premise of the previous National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children from 2009 to 2020 is about redressing overrepresentation of our kids in out-of-home care. And it was great to hear Brendan and Brian talking about the next iteration having a clear focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And SNAKE and the Family Matters campaign are really wanting to see Aboriginal leadership be part of that new iteration of the agreement, of the framework. For 2021, going forward, there are a number of goals that we are seeking in the Family Matters campaign. Every year we produce the Family Matters report, which reflects on each jurisdiction's efforts around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care. We assess those efforts against what we call the building blocks, which are aimed at reducing the numbers of our kids that are separated from families and communities. And we provide a scorecard in that report. And we also look at what, from a community perspective, what's being done in community-controlled organisations and what are the green shoots of change that are emerging. And there are many things that are happening, but there is still a lot of work to be done in this space. So our priorities for the Family Matters campaign for this year will be, we're going to continue to push for a national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children's Commissioner. We have, I think if people have read the Family as Culture report that came out of New South Wales late last year, written by Professor Megan Davis, the report really highlights the complexity of the out-of-home care system. It's only dealing with New South Wales, but I think that gives us a good pointer to what some of the challenges are across this nation. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need We need good mechanisms in the system to keep governments accountable, to keep the system accountable, and to support our families to keep their kids at home. We need a strong Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled sector, and it's really pleasing that part of the national Closing the Gap agreement includes an effort to grow community-controlled sectors around the country. But we'd like to see Aboriginal peak bodies in every state and territory. Those states and territories that have a child protection, an Aboriginal child protection peak, or a large community-controlled organisation working closely with government are getting better outcomes, and that's particularly evident in Queensland and Victoria. We certainly support Brian and Brendan's calls for the dedicated focus in the next national framework for protecting Australia's children to have a focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, but we want a clear governance role for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership to support that priority. And we want to see, we'll be calling for an exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from permanent care and forced adoption measures. We see these as very risky for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, given the overrepresentation in the system. And there is that potential for more and more of our children to be permanently separated from their families, from their communities, and from their culture. And when you think about that, it is very reminiscent of what happened with the Stolen Generations. For people that want to support the Family Matters campaign, you can go to the Family Matters website, just Google it and go on there, and organisations and individuals can sign up to the campaign. There are a lot of ideas about how you can support it this year. We'll be launching the report in November, on November the 12th, and following that up with the National Week of Action. So I want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank NAPCAN again for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's terrific to hear your thoughts about what needs to be done in the future in relation particularly to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their wellbeing. So I urge everyone to follow up and have a look at the Family Matters website. Okay, now to our last speaker this morning, I'd like to say hi to Leith and welcome you to our panel. I'm sure many of you are already aware of the very aptly named Every Child campaign. Leith is the new co-chair of the Every Child campaign and Executive Director, Child and Family of the Benevolent Society. She's here to tell you all about what they've been up to and how you can get involved. Thanks, Leith.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks, NAPCAN, for the invitation to join this webinar. And congratulations on your successful pivot to online events in this year's Child Protection Week. I too acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's continuing connection to land, water and community. This morning I'm on the Yagara and Turrbal land in Brisbane, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge the ongoing work of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders across the country to advance the interests of children, young people and families, and to ensure their children have the opportunity to grow up safe and well with family and in community and culture. As you've heard many times during this week and before now, COVID-19 has exacerbated and exposed the existing risks and hardships for children, young people and families across Australia. We at Every Child see that this public health crisis has also created opportunities for change. NAPCAN and many of us around Australia have seized the moment to try and shift public debate and action to build back better with a children's focus. As you've heard from Brenton earlier, to maintain economic and social foundations at a time when deep recession looms, governments have stepped up to invest in jobs, in families, in mental health support, early years services and much more. So Every Child's joining a chorus of voices at the moment. We're calling on governments to put the future of children and young people front and centre of any economic and social recovery efforts to truly put children first. I'm just going to tell you a little bit now about Every Child. We are a national alliance of over 70 organisations led by a steering committee of leaders from 25 non-government organisations. Our aim is for the wellbeing of children and young people to be elevated as a nation-building priority, for investment in prevention and early intervention to be enhanced significantly, and for agencies to collaborate beyond their silos. We are united in our belief that the best national foundation any country can have is healthy, safe, well-educated children and young people who are confident in themselves and confident in their future. While most Australian children are developing well, we know that a sizable percentage have remained developmentally vulnerable, and you've heard some of those statistics from previous panel presentations. If we were to produce a report card on how children and young people were faring before the impact of COVID-19, we would be clearly saying need for improvement. Pre-COVID policy settings have failed to address the conditions that produce those vulnerabilities. At Every Child, we believe to truly put children and young people first, governments and service providers must work together to end fragmented and siloed responses that are intended to address part but not all of the problem. Many of us can name examples of good practice and collaboration that overcome fragmentation of services to children and families. But this must be the norm, not the exception, and available in every neighbourhood and community, not just a fortunate few. And I'm really heartened to hear the work that's been happening, for instance, in the national framework that's clearly identified that issue. To truly put children and young people first, we have to have better integrated programs, services across all the domains of wellbeing. So every child must have a safe place to call home, live in a family where there's decent income, have access to quality learning and healthcare, and be confident and connected to community, culture and family. So put simply, Every Child has been operating and was for over a year now. It was launched in August last year. However, we see now is the time to really seize the moment and push through the system change that's long overdue, and putting children and young people as central to those priorities. So what are some of our Build Back Better priorities? We're working at multiple levels to achieve change. Every Child is collaborating with the Australian and New Zealand School of Government, ANSOG, to develop and deliver systems change leadership forums. Many of you would know that ANSOG is a highly respected education and professional development organisation that's recognised for advancing public sector leadership. The goal of these forums is to problem solve and be solution focused in tackling three main aims: to elevate and exchange policy and program ideas on the most effective ways to work across multiple agencies and sectors to respond to the needs of children and young people; to work to embed a systems approach in decision making and machinery of government mechanisms that enable system-wide and multi-agency responses; and to improve the sharing and translation of evidence and data that will guide innovative responses to children and young people. In summary, the aim of this project is to develop leaders in the public sector, the not-for-profit and First Nations leaders that collaborate and foster multi-agency integrated investment and program models. So it's a really exciting initiative. Another example of a Build Back Better initiative is our work on the It Takes 6 communications tool with ERACI. So Every Child is working with ERACI to promote the 6 domains of wellbeing in the ERACI NEST framework through developing a communication tool that's easily accessible to the public, to service providers and decision makers. Our work on this highlights that these domains are interdependent, yet we know that's not generally reflected in the way our early childhood education and care, education, health, mental health, disability, housing, income support, family support, the list goes on and on, child protection and youth justice systems interact. Every Child's work with ERACI on It Takes 6 is intended to support the development of a communication tool that will help everybody to understand and talk about how children have needs across all areas: material basics, education, health, community participation and more. We've been testing this concept with a range of audiences and are working on ways to bring it to life for decision makers, and using the voice of children and young people to strengthen the messages about what they need to do well. So this is another one you can watch out for and get involved in. Finally, another example to share is our work as part of the Australia Together, the Build Back Better National Community Recovery Summit. Every Child's part of a leadership group along with Logan Together and others to advance the Build Back Better agenda across 4 policy pillars: jobs creation, social housing, child wellbeing, and most importantly, local decision making and local delivery. You'd probably be aware in July we hosted a National Community Recovery Summit, and now in the process of presenting the policy asks to government ministers and advisors, again with a focus on those things, both policy and initiatives that put children first. So there's actually great momentum at the moment, even as we emerge from a global pandemic, and there's lots of campaigning for change in 2020. Our call to action for you is to let's all seize the moment to come out of the crisis with a determination to build systems that work better for children and work better for families. We encourage you to join all of the campaigns that are on. You've heard Richard talk to Family Matters, Thrive by 5, and our campaign, Every Child, and help shape new systems. Engage with the work being undertaken on the Reshape National Framework. You can visit our website, and I think it's going to be published here as well, everychild.co, and we encourage you to join our nation building campaign to prioritise the needs of children and young people. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, NAPCAN.
Thank you, Leith. It's great to hear what's going on in Every Child campaign. So, and also I think you've given us a lot to think about how we can get involved, which was actually going to be the question that I was going to ask each of our presenters. We have had some questions coming through from our audience, but I wanted to ask first, and I might put this to Brian first, and then each of you. What would be your key takeaway message for our audience on how they can play a part in building back together right now? So over to you, Brian.
Thank you. Just a small question.
Just a small question.
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, I think it's continuing to be involved in the variety, not only in the work that they're doing, but in these various national campaigns. I think people will be very aware there's a range of initiatives that have begun in the last six months, and some a little bit longer now. And as I mentioned, the National Coalition's work on the National Framework is now like 12, 15 years old. So in a sense, that represents a campaign that many of us undertook, going back 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think it's being engaged with these campaigns because although at times maybe the asks can be rather disparate and people might sort of wonder, well, why so many things? I think what they all symbolise is one really important intent for our nation, and that is that we become known as a nation that really values, honours and respects children and young people. And we don't just give lip service to that we actually do those things, not only through government policies and programs, but that this message and this intent is driven through our communities, through business, and through our non-government sector, in a way that so we become a nation that is known for this. So being part of these campaigns, I think, is really quite crucial. Lending your support where you can, and which I think at the end of the day signifies that we're all about this strategic change, this big national change to take place in Australia.
Thanks, Brian. Well done, putting you on the spot there. Richard, over to you. What is the one key takeaway message for our audience from your perspective?
Look, I think, yeah, Brian's really stolen everyone's thunder a bit, but I think the key message I'd send is that you know, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and children, the challenges are really great, and you know, we have complex systems, systems that are, you know, where the money is spent at the tertiary end of the system rather than at the early intervention and prevention end. We need to get that, you know, rebalance there. And you know, the systems are complex, and you know, as much as they're difficult, the people that actually work in them and have expertise, they're complex for them to understand. And then, but if we just think about people in community and children caught up in those systems, it's even you know, it's a greater mystery. So I think we have a big challenge, but I think we have some emerging levers that we can really pull on and use to pressure the system. And the campaigns that have been talked about are one of those. But there we have these, I think, two big policy things from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective is the national framework, because that's a long-term policy, has been, you know, up to now and it's been going. But as Brian said, there was a fight to just get that idea, that concept up. But we've got it there now and we're going forward with it. So Aboriginal people providing some leadership into the priorities around Aboriginal children in that framework, but also this linking to the new national Closing the Gap agreement, where this coalition of peak Aboriginal organisations, there's 50 of us, have come together and we've negotiated a new agreement, a partnership with all governments across Australia. And again, that's another strong lever that, you know, there's some really good principles in there. I know it hasn't worked that well to date, but there are some really good principles in this new agreement around strong partnerships, growing community-controlled sectors, tackling racism, and getting better data, as well as the targets are also in there. So there's a couple of things. So I think we have to be optimistic, although sometimes it's really difficult. But big challenges, but also opportunities. So get on board.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
Brenton, would you like to have a stab at a takeaway message to the audience?
Absolutely. Look, well, I can't disagree with anything that Richard and Brian have said. I suppose, so from where I'm sitting, as we go into the next successor plan and how we bring that together, I think it's really important for the audience to engage with the campaigns and engage with DSS and the government's Relationships Australia, others who are going to be involved in bringing this thing together, so we truly understand what's happening on the ground. The last successor plan, a lot has changed for children in Australia in that time, and things like the need for an e-safety commissioner and other things like that have really changed some of the pressures that are on children in Australia. So we need to understand how that is. We've got processes that are coming forward around youth engagement and the youth task force and the like, which will help with that. But I think it's imperative that the audience brings those issues to government so that we can see those things. The other thing in my mind is that identifying and understanding where are the best areas for us to target our interventions. Brian made the very good point that we've done a lot, but query, are we really getting ahead? So if we're going to devote time and resources and a lot of effort, where's the best intervention points for us? How are we supporting the family unit to support the child as we go forward? How do we prevent children from going into care? And how do we support children in out-of-home care if they're in that place? So for me, that becomes a very important part. And the opportunity here is that as we go into the new Successor strategy, at the same time, we're looking at the next national plan for women and children escaping violence and other things. There's great opportunity to draw linkages between all of these to really enhance the outcomes that we can achieve across governments and across the sectors to get the best outcome for the investment that we're going to make. And in this case, you know, prevent children from ending in those places and give them every opportunity to thrive within society.
Thanks, Brenton. And I think your point about giving different campaigns, melding the really important anti-violence ones together is a really interesting and important approach. Leith, your turn. You gave us some wonderful ideas about how to build back better in your presentation. Is there one key message that you'd like the audience to take action on or go away with?
Probably just the thing I would say, something that we've been working on, and this is probably a benevolent society example as well as an every child example, is how practice on the ground can inform advocacy, because it is something where practitioners working with families, working with children can often feel like that's arm's length from them and that other people do that, or it's something that only, you know, somebody who is a leader in an organisation, for instance, can do. So we've been really working on and how we can actually draw those lines, because it's actually those stories, the narrative, the work that people are doing, and I hate using the word frontline, but people who are doing there is often where the real innovation is happening, because they're finding solutions. So look, we're looking, you know, I'm really interested in everybody seeing a place for themselves there to be able to bring those ideas forward and never stop challenging the barriers, because that's how we will further develop the policy and the approaches that we need to take.
Thank you. The very first presenter webinar we had last Monday, economist Richard Dennis said, you know, we can't do everything, but what COVID has taught us is that we can do anything when we feel it's important enough. And that really inspired me when I heard him say that, you know, and one example that one of the doctors during the week spoke about was that telehealth was a 10-year plan, and in fact it was brought in 2 weeks when it had to happen. So we can do things when we have the will and commitment across everyone. I think that's what this conversation and what we're trying to do in National Child Protection Week is drive that commitment. So thank you for your responses. In a lot of your presentations today, you emphasise the central role of the voice of children and young people and hearing their priorities. So I suppose, how might children and young people continue to be included in these discussions? How might they become more friendly and give children and young people the support to speak up in some of your campaigns so that they're taken seriously in policies that impact on their lives? Who would like to put their hand up to go first on that one? You know, Richard.
Well, I'll dive. Yeah, I'll dive in. Look, I think from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective, it's the strength for us in hearing the voice of children is through our community-controlled services that are working directly with children and families, and that we not only hear those voices, as you said, Trace, but we act on what children are expressing as their needs. And I've seen this a number of times in conversations with kids that have been, you know, come out the other side of the out-of-home care system. They know what the challenges are. They know what they need, and they know the things that that the system needs to do to improve outcomes for them. So, and we need to provide platforms for children's voices. And to hear from young people, and it happened at the Families Australia, one of the last conferences we had a panel of young people speaking, and it's a very powerful thing. It's you know, we have to be more prepared to hear directly from young people and children, and we have to be prepared to take on board what they're saying. We have to be prepared to act.
Thank you, Richard. And Brian did mention, yes, you did mention the consultation that had taken part. Just briefly, did you want to add something to that, Brian?
Oh, just to say, yeah. Look, just to say, working with young people is becoming an increasingly important part of our practice at Family Australia. What we are about at the national level is as a sort of social policy thinking and informing or advising organisation. It's absolutely central to our practice now, that young people's voices are heard, and as much as we possibly can, to sort of insert those voices and views and perspectives into the policy making process. I'm encouraged that there's a lot more responsiveness on the part of governments to hearing those voices. And I suppose our commitment is to, as Richard says, to keep providing the opportunities for those voices to come through. What we have also found very, very important is that once those voices are engaged and activated, that it's not just sort of a peak moment activity. In our consultations around the country over the last year or so, we found some fabulous examples where organisations and even governments, and here I'm thinking of the NT government, has put a lot of effort into having a young person's panel, and that they work with young people who are on the panel or the reference group to help mentor and develop them, but also to get their views in an ongoing way about how to improve their processes. So I think it's that sort of construction of this respectful two-way feedback and this model that many of us are working through at the moment. And I think, you know, that's a really important direction for the future.
Thanks, Brian. Actually, for those who are interested, we had a fantastic series of webinars yesterday that involved children's commissioners from across Australia and New Zealand, and they really talked a lot about the importance of listening to children and having their voice heard. So those in the audience can try and get back and hear that. I'm conscious now that we probably need to wrap up. What is our final webinar for National Child Protection Week? It has been quite an extraordinary experience to put together what's normally an in-person campaign to suddenly go online like this. And thank you to each of you for committing the time and effort to come online today for this. We've heard from so many experts and practitioners this week. We've learned a lot about the importance of data and statistics. And in fact, the evidence is out there about what works. Now we just got to translate that into action. And the campaigns and strategies and frameworks that you guys are working on is all part of that process. So to finish up today, as we head towards the weekend, I would like those in the audience to think about at least one thing that you can do today or soon that would make a difference for children. For example, you could sign up to some of the campaigns that you've heard about today. You can encourage others to get involved as well. You could write a letter about the issue and lobby your local politician if you'd like to take that angle. Or you can do something as simple as saying hello to your neighbour who you've not met before, or host a street barbecue. I know in times of COVID, the individual meet and greet is a little bit different, but where you live in the community and connections, we've heard a lot of evidence this week that that is so, so important for children's development and well-being, to be able to play safely and in a safe environment. So let's not forget the incredible importance of playgroups and neighbourhood support and knowing your neighbours, supporting new parents. These are really basic, practical things that can look after the well-being of children. Make sure that the sports club that your child belongs to actually has child-safe guidelines that have been brought out as a result of the commission. So these are just a few little things, but go to the NAPCAN website, go to Families Australia, go to Every Child, go to Family Matters, check out what's available and see what suits you. Because we need all Australians to take collective action, to play their part to make change happen. As I said before, look how fast we took action when COVID hit. With the same commitment, we can put children first and ensure that we actually do reduce the rate of child abuse and neglect and family violence in our community starting now, because children can't wait. They're here with us already. I hope that this National Child Protection Week has helped to inspire you to take action. But I know who has inspired me this week and that is my fantastic team of professionals at NAPCAN, who have worked tirelessly to put together this amazing array of international, national and local presenters. And I want to thank each and every one of them for all of their hard work. There's never been a tougher year than 2020, and the team at NAPCAN have made it into an outstanding year for putting children first. So thank you all for listening and joining in. Good luck. Farewell for now. Take care and stay safe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.